afternoon session, which is on the Constitution generally, and we're waiting for two speakers from Sydney, Keith Windschuttle, who's written the book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, then The Breakup of Australia, his latest book, and also Damien Freeman, who was one of the co-editors of The Forgotten People, which was about Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. He, with Julian Lisa, proposed a separate declaration outside of the Constitution, and he's written a book called Abbott's Right, which is about the philosophical basis of the Liberal Party and the leadership of Tony Abbott, which I found very interesting. But they're on their way because the foolish place where I live doesn't seem to be able to run the airport, and they're already thinking of having a second airport. Anyway, I would like to say a few words about the Constitution. Bearing in mind that we got into talking about the Constitution at these meetings because of Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott came to a conference, it was a couple of years ago, and he came to speak, he was the keynote speaker. He didn't tell me what he was going to speak about. When he gave his speech, it was that ACM should come behind the Indigenous recognition of the Indigenous people. I knew that would be terribly unpopular with a lot of people in ACM, and that I had no authority to say anything about it anyway. So I offered the vote of thanks, taken by surprise a little, and I said that we would support the people being involved, not just in approving or disapproving of the motion at the time of the referendum, but right from the beginning through a constitutional convention. So that's where we are, and I wanted to say some words about the Constitution, not because ACM would wish to take a position on other constitutional issues beyond our remit, but we ought to be in this because of the importance of our Constitution. We should be stressing how wonderful the Constitution is. So in the afternoon, we have a number of speakers, including speakers that you know, but including Senator James Patterson, who is here on the platform, and I'm delighted to introduce him. When he was introduced in Perth, and I had the opportunity of asking a question, I said, it has been said of the House of Lords that it is living proof of life after death. But seeing you, Senator, I could see we couldn't possibly say that about the Australian Senator, because he is the youngest, I think the youngest Senator, and certainly the youngest Liberal Senator, and has a very interesting background. He was Deputy Executive Director of the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs, graduated in Arts and Commerce from Melbourne University, a former President of the Young Liberals of this state and of Australia, and writes and speaks very well and has two excellent opinion pieces, I think, in the Melbourne newspapers about this issue of Indigenous recognition. So what we're doing this afternoon is we're going to look at, after a brief introduction from me, while I hope that Keith Windschuttle and Damien can arrive from the airport, we're going to look at Indigenous recognition, same-sex marriage, Brexit and the Commonwealth, then have our afternoon tea, and after that go on to, when Peter Manuel joins us, water rights. You'll wonder what that has to do with the Constitution, but I'll tell you then. Parliament, the Senate, because of proposals from Tony Abbott about changing the Senate, on which Senator Patterson has expressed strong views in The Spectator, but unfortunately he can't stay, but we can repeat what those views are. 4-year terms and accountability, freedom of speech, and electoral fraud. So I would wish to remind you of the mission of ACM, is to preserve, to protect, and to defend our heritage in our Australian constitutional system. It's not just the Australian Constitution, it's the Australian constitutional system. I think we should try and stress that, because it's more than just the federal constitution, which is a compact, it's a division of powers between the states and the new entity, but it's also the Statute of Westminster, which began apart from the Balfour Declaration, it really began legally the process of full independence. The Australia Acts, when the Constitution was fully brought to Australia, because until then the states were technically colonies of London, just technically. The whole, also on the other side, the state constitutions. We mustn't forget the states. The states are sovereign states, they're part of the Commonwealth. But also there is what can best be termed the golden thread. That is what was brought at the time of the settlement, going back through the glorious revolution, back to the Magna Carta. It's a whole heritage of constitutional practice. That's our constitutional system. It's not just that federal compact. Going to the Constitution, I think it's worth reminding people. I remember at the time of the referendum, there was a letter in the Courier Mail, which I should have answered, but I didn't, which said that it is well known that the British strongly opposed federation because they wanted to control the colonies. Actually, the British proposed federation in 1846. Earl Grey wanted to set up a local legislature on the basis that that would be the place where many problems would go rather than having to refer them to London. And I see that Damien has arrived. Damien, you are most welcome to join the panel, and we're sorry about the inferior qualities of the Sydney airport. We're just talking a little about the Constitution. Left to the politicians of that time, who weren't organised in a two-party system, but left to the politicians at the time, it was clear after the first convention that we would probably turn out to be several countries, that they would never agree because of the way it was constructed. They could never agree on a constitution because once the convention developed a constitution, sent it to the colonial parliaments, they all disagreed with one another. It was this wonderful person, Sir John Quick, at Corowa in 1893, who proposed what was to become the solution, the Corowa Plan. And the Corowa Plan was directly elect a convention, not just an appointed convention, directly elect the convention. And most importantly, when the convention had reached the stage of a draft constitution, send it to everybody, show it around, let the politicians comment on it, the colonial parliaments comment on it, but then finalise the constitution, and that it would then go to the Australian people in each of the several states by way of a referendum. And that was the wonderful solution which was proposed at Corowa and which empowered the people, but also meant that once the Corowa Plan was adopted in 1897, once it was actually applied, in that extraordinarily short period of 1897 to 1901, it was really 1900, 1901 was the 1st of January 1901, in that extraordinarily short period, the convention met, a draft constitution was prepared, commented on, sent to all of the colonies. New South Wales kicked up a fuss over one aspect, so it had to be done again, and eventually it was passed in all of the colonies. West Australia was a little late, so the Queen had to wait before she proclaimed the Constitution, but it was really an extraordinary thing done in less than 4 years. And as you know, you can't build a dam in Australia in 4 years' time. We unite, or the people united a country in 4 years. That's the little piece of paper from the conference. We should always emphasize what an extraordinary achievement this was. And I'm just have a quote here from Quick and Garran. Sir John Quick and Sir Robert Garran wrote the seminal, the magisterial book on the Constitution. Never before have a group of self-governing, practically independent communities without external pressure or foreign complications of any kind, deliberately chosen of their own free will to put aside their provincial jealousies and come together as one people from a simple intellectual and sentimental conviction of the folly of disunion and the advantages of nationhood. And then they refer to other countries. But the extraordinary thing was, this was quite extraordinary. And the idea that it should be approved by the people was revolutionary. We should really be proud of that. And the young people in our schools should be taught this. And Sir John Quick should be on our banknotes, and we should hold him up as a wonderful guide to the nation. proud of a people who, without the compulsion of war or the fear of conquest, because that was so often drove union in Europe and in other places, have succeeded in agreeing upon the terms of a binding and indissoluble social compact. Quite extraordinary. Until 1920, the High Court interpreted the Constitution as it was intended. And the intention was that the Commonwealth would have those shared powers and some exclusive powers as set out in the Constitution. And as the first Prime Minister said, any exercise of powers outside of that list is prohibited under the Constitution. It was the doctrine of the reserved powers. That is, what's not in the Constitution obviously belongs to the states, such as, for example, education. The Engineers case changed that. By that time, Sir Isaac Isaacs, who was a strong centralist at the, he was a Victorian politician. He was a strong centralist. He believed in a strong central polity. He was defeated at the convention over that. By the time he came back to the High Court, he and other judges were prepared, as they did in the Engineers case, where an award was given for engineers, a federal award given for engineers employed by the state public service. They abandoned the then rule of interpretation that powers not mentioned in the Constitution are reserved to the state. So that was a dramatic change. And since then, in my view, you may not agree, in my view, it's all been downhill because this has strengthened a central entity in Canberra and weakened the states. And at the same time, there was always a view at the time of Federation that we would have more, as the population grew, more states would also emerge, rather than all these, for example, in New South Wales, so much is controlled from Sydney. In Queensland, so much is controlled from Brisbane, particularly matters which really relate to the north of Australia. I won't say anything about Victoria because I wouldn't be so impertinent as to tell you what should happen in your states. We are one of the world's 7 oldest continuing democracies. One of the 7. And incidentally, 5 are constitutional monarchies, 4 of which have Elizabeth as their queen. And we come now to Indigenous recognition of the Constitution. Keith Windschuttle is on his way, but we'll have to start anyway. And he will add to this. Keith, as I said, is an editor, an author, and an historian. And there are 2 books of considerable relevance to this: The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, The Breakup of Australia, and his latest piece, which is in Quadrant, which answers the recommendations of the Referendum Council. And then we have on the panel, as I mentioned, Damien Freeman, who is a philosopher and lawyer, which is an interesting mixture, who studied at Sydney University and Magdalen College, Cambridge, and now teaches at Pembroke College, Cambridge. And in this particular area, he was the co-editor of The Forgotten People, which illustrates liberal and conservative approaches to recognizing the Indigenous peoples. He, as I mentioned before you came, was the co-author with, or co-proposer with, I think here he is. We have Keith coming in. He was the co-author, co-proposer of a separate declaration outside of the Constitution, which would have avoided the problems of justiciability and so on. Keith, do come in. And thank you. We know of the problems in our airport. And more recently, a really superb book, Abbott's Right, which is, I found it fascinating, particularly the way in which you treated Edmund Burke. I think you quite rightly identified him as so important, and you traced through the conservative tradition from Menzies to Abbott, with a very clever title, Abbott's Rights. And that book will be available today?
It is, yes.
Good. So, and it was signed.
Not just by me, but by Tony Abbott.
Ah, well, there you are.
What could be better?
And unlike what's happening, I heard this morning that Mrs. Clinton charges about $140 to go to her book launches, but you have to pay about $1,000 to have a signed book. And there's extra if it's a signed book with a photograph. So Damien, I think, without committing you, will do it for nothing. apart
For,
from buying
for
a book.
ACM, I will.
And I mentioned Senator James Patterson. There are two of Senator Patterson's pieces. Our Constitution already gives First Nations a say, and radical approach to Indigenous recognition will fail. So shall we begin with the Referendum Council recommendations? And those are two, and perhaps Keith, would you like to give us your views on that? And there are microphones there, and later when we have questions, could you put your hand up and ask for a microphone, because we're not getting this onto the tape. Yes, Keith,
Thank you, David. Breathless, but I'm here. Look, the Referendum Council put two proposals to both Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten as to what the Aboriginal people of Australia and their representatives wanted. There was no preliminary survey or constitutional conventions funded by the Commonwealth Government in any state. There are about 12 for Aboriginal people, 3% of the population, but for the other 97% of us, there were no constitutional conventions funded by the Commonwealth in any of the states or anywhere. The only one that I know of that occurred was in fact chaired by our gracious host today, David Flint, which Quadrant magazine put on a constitutional convention where we had for and against voices, unlike the constitutional convention held by funded by the Commonwealth Government, which pretty much put a unified view, mainly in my view, the Noel Pearson philosophy of how to get sovereignty for Aboriginal people by presenting it as harmless reformism that anyone in their right mind should support. Now, there are two proposals that the Referendum Council put to both Turnbull and Shorten. The first one, I should say that Shorten immediately agreed to that on the assumption of a Labor government and Bill Shorten as Prime Minister, that he would put these two proposals into action. Malcolm Turnbull got them and has yet to respond. Up until that point, up until he got the formal proposals, he was in favour of this motion and has made several statements supporting the general idea of constitutional recognition. Now, the first proposal, which was, and in fact the only one that is attempt to make a legal change to Australia, was the Constitution recommended the Aborigines have a voice in the Australian Parliament, recognising that this would not be a legally binding voice. It would be an advisory body, but a stronger advisory body than the ones we've had so far, because it would have the constitutional approval of the Australian people behind it, which, legally, if it's not endorsed by the Parliament, then a voice in the Parliament is not very legally effective. Well, apparently legally effective, but it certainly would be very powerful in its moral effectiveness and in its political effectiveness. And we've had advisory groups telling the federal government what Aboriginal people want and what's the best policies for them for the best part of 50 years now. In the early days, there were no Aborigines on these groups, but since the 1970s, they've been dominated. They've been Aboriginal-only groups, and there's one now called the Congress, the National. No, it's not First Nations. It's the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. That's the formal name of the group that's now advising the Commonwealth Government. So they've already had these things for a long time. But it's important to read the wording of this proposal, because, in my view, there's a hidden agenda in it, which is not really hidden to anyone who has read the Australian Constitution. And I won't read you the whole thing, but it says we want to have a representative body advising the Commonwealth Government of Aboriginal people and about Aboriginal affairs. And it says, this should include the function of monitoring the use of the heads of power in section 5126, which is, the Commonwealth has the power to make laws for the people of any race, Well, that's what you'd expect. But also, it said, for the function of monitoring the use of the heads of power of Section 122. Now, most people who read that, including every journalist who's written about this, has no idea what Section 122 says. They haven't bothered to look it up. But in fact, it's packed with dynamite, in my view, because it says that it allows the Commonwealth to make laws for any territory surrendered by any state or otherwise acquired by the Commonwealth, and allows the representation of that territory in either house of the Parliament. Now, we have two examples where states have surrendered territory to the Commonwealth in the past. That was where South Australia surrendered the Northern Territory to the Commonwealth, and where New South Wales surrendered the ACT to the Commonwealth. Now, these are they're not states, but they're territories, and this is part of the Aboriginal political class's agenda. They want to have an Aboriginal state which has Aboriginal sovereignty, which has Aboriginal laws, and which, in fact, is a separate part of Australia, but standing out in line with the Commonwealth Grants Commission, or whatever it's called now, whatever the acronym is. It's where the Commonwealth dishes out money to the states. They will be along with that meeting, and they will be asking for money for their own separate organisations. Now, another point that should be made about the first proposal by the Referendum Council is that they say any voice to Parliament should be designed so that it could support and promote a treaty-making process. Now, as John Howard perfectly accurately said, treaties are made not between one nation and its own people, they are made between sovereign nations. And the Aboriginal political class agrees, yes, that's right, you have to be a sovereign body to make a treaty with somebody else. They don't tell that to mostly their friendly journalists, and they don't advertise it. But if you read the academic literature on this and the legal academic literature, you find that that's in fact what they want. They want their own separate state, and they want to have their own laws, but they still want it to be funded by the Commonwealth of Australia. In fact, what the debate has now produced is not that they want their own separate state, they want their own separate states. And you can see this very clearly in the second proposal that the Referendum Council put to the Commonwealth. That is, they support the idea of a declaration of recognition. Now, this would not be written into the Constitution. It would be simply a political statement made by the Commonwealth recognising Aboriginal people. But now, if you look at what's gone on in the Parliament since the absolute degradation of Commonwealth Parliament under the Gillard government, you'll find that in fact there was a bill. There's so many bills passed under Gillard because she had control of the Senate and she could pass anything she liked, thanks to the Greens. But she got through a recognition bill, which said that it recognised the existence of the Aborigines on the Australian continent as first. They got there first. It recognised their continuing relationship. It acknowledged and respected their cultures, language and heritage. So we've had that bill since March 2013. So that's a recognition by the Commonwealth Parliament. But what's the point of having a declaration of recognition? Well, there's 2 points to it. A formal declaration, not just a bill in the Parliament, but one that's tied up with the constitutional recognition of the Aboriginal voice. And that is that what they want is to declare the existence of Aboriginal sovereignty over the whole of Australia, except, some of the Aboriginal political class still say, well, the Mabo decision meant that the freehold in Australia that's been allocated to these new coming white European people, we'll let that stand because that would be a bit hard ask to get through. But the rest of it, we want sovereignty over it, which is most of Aboriginal land. In fact, in my book, The Breakup of Australia, I've got the end papers of the book are a map from the Native Title Tribunal, which shows how much land has already been given to Aboriginal people under land rights, which is already 30%, and how much land is going to be given to them under the next round of native title judgments, which have already been accepted for adjudication. And once they get accepted for adjudication, it's always in favour of the Aborigines, well, 90-something percent, 95% of the time, on the track record of the Native Title Tribunal. So what it means is that 60% of the continent will be will be Aboriginal native title, and the Aboriginal political class want to make that amount of land not just native title, but also sovereign Aboriginal land.
And at that point, perhaps we could just hold the rest and go to Damien, because I think Damien you would have a view on these proposals from the Referendum Council, and you also were involved in the drafting of that declaration with Julie and Lisa, which is published separately.
Yeah, so let me say how I got involved with this. As you know, we're on this trajectory now because John Howard, at the end of his prime ministership, said that if he were re-elected, he would pursue constitutional recognition. So that sort of started it, and we've had a situation where every prime minister since then had endorsed the idea that we should be doing this. So I was sort of talking to Julie and Lisa. He and I, when we were undergraduates in the lead up to the Republic referendum, had both been involved very actively, vigorously with Australians for Constitutional Monarchy, and indeed that was my first experience of politics. He'd been a local councillor before then. Anyhow, so that was really our engagement with the Constitution, came from ACM for both of us. And we were the sort of people who were inherently opposed to changing the Constitution. We'd grown up like that from our university days. And this was a time Tony Abbott was about to become Prime Minister. We knew this. He'd committed himself to doing this. He was very personally committed to it. So our question to each other really was, well, look, Tony's going to become Prime Minister. He's going to push to make this happen. Is there any way that we could support this? Is there any way of addressing this issue that would uphold the Constitution, that would be consistent with our commitment to the Constitution? Because if not, we were the sort of people who were going to fight against it. Well, we didn't want to find ourselves in that position. So that was how Julian and I started thinking about this. That could we both knew Tony from ACM days. Was there a way that we could help him to achieve this that would be consistent with our commitment to the Constitution? And that led really to the development of both of these ideas. So we together put forward this idea for a Declaration of Recognition. The Declaration of Recognition came about because we were both very concerned that we shouldn't have symbolic language in the Constitution. We shouldn't put any words in the Constitution that will give the judges of the High Court discretion to start interpreting them. And we know, we all know there's no safe way of putting in a preamble. So Harry Gibbs, who was, of course, well, he was a charter signatory of ACM, but he wrote a paper on the preamble for the Samuel Griffith Society, which you'll find on their website, where he talks about the fact that a preamble can be used to interpret the Constitution. So you can't put something in a preamble and think it won't affect the Constitution. So we were very committed to the idea that no symbolic language is going to just be put in the Constitution because you say it doesn't have any effect, but you can't guarantee that because we've seen the sort of mischief the High Court makes, and we're not going to give them the opportunity to do that. So that led to our idea of this declaration, which was to say, well, look, if we need some kind of symbolic statement as a nation, let's put it outside the Constitution. You can say something poetic there if you want. The High Court can't get its hands on it, right? So that was really the starting point for that. And we then engaged with Noel Pearson, and he started to see the merit of why we were saying that. He had advocated the so-called the racial non-discrimination clause in the Constitution, the so-called one clause Bill of Rights, and we were opposed to that. And he could see that the Conservatives were just going to come out and defeat that. There was no way the Conservatives were going to put that in. It would hand over too much political decision making to the High Court, right? To decide whether a particular law discriminated adversely against Indigenous people. So he could see we were never going to agree to that. So he then says, well, look, if that's not going to if that's not going to get up, you've got to try and see it from our perspective and see how we see this and what we're trying to do. And it was that conversation really that led to this idea of a voice to Parliament as a compromise way of doing this that would address the concerns of the Indigenous people, again, but do it in a way that would be acceptable to constitutional conservatives. So let me just say something about what is envisaged by this voice to Parliament. One thing I can say is it is not meant to be located within the Parliament. It is not a chamber of Parliament. It is not an extra house of the Aboriginal House of Lords, a chamber of Aboriginal princes. It's not a part of the Parliament. That was this idea that it's a voice to Parliament rather than a voice within Parliament. That was something we got them to see. There was no doubt that was how this was meant to be structured. Now, beyond that, it's true that this voice, it's uncertain what that would look like. I agree about that. There are at least two ways that this could be set up, and I had a hand in getting the drafting ready for both of them. So Professor Anne Toomey has drafted one proposition for how the Constitution might be changed. Warren Mundine has put forward another proposition. So there are at least two ways that this might be done. The central thing that we've set up with all of this is that we should have a way of giving the Indigenous people a voice that doesn't erode in any way the power of Parliament. So however this is going to be done, the idea is that it's delegated to Parliament to have control over the way this works. So the Parliament will always be able to tailor this. Will always be, if it's not working, can always amend the way it's going to work. It's not established within the Constitution. It's only that the Constitution will say to Parliament, you've got to set this up. You do it the way you think is best, but we're saying there's an obligation to set it up. So I can only say that I have worked firsthand with these Indigenous people who proposed this, and I can only say to you, I mean, maybe they're very two-faced. Maybe I'm politically naive. Those are both real possibilities. I can only say to you, the people I've been dealing with are not looking for any kind of sovereignty. They've come to see the need for a compromise position. And I can only say to you, where we're at now, the Prime Minister has said at the Garma Festival, he described this as big ideas that are short on detail, and we need the detail. So I'm now committed to working with the Indigenous people to try and find the detail. So I can only say, if there are any of you who believe it's important to uphold the Constitution and at the same time think we should be open to the idea of addressing this issue, which John Howard put on the table and Tony Abbott actively endorsed, that's where we're at now, is trying to say, well, okay, what would the detail look like? And there are at least two options for how this could be done, as I said. And that's really where we're at, is trying to find a way that will address the concerns of the Indigenous people without undermining the sovereignty of Parliament, without giving any new power to the judges of the High Court. I believe it's possible, and so I've committed myself to trying to do it. So, for what it's worth, that's an alternative view on it.
Thank you, Damien. Philip, has you've written on this in the Melbourne newspaper. What is your view on an Aboriginal voice, a separate Aboriginal voice?
Thank you, David, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I should start, as I often do at functions like this, with a confession, which is to say that historically I have not been a constitutional monarchist. In fact, for a long time, probably the best description of my views on the constitutional monarchy is as a lapsed Republican. But it is through the advocacy of people like you, David, and organisations like the ACM that I've come to really appreciate much better the virtues of our constitution and the dangers of changing it. And for me, a particular turning point was the local government referendum, or the proposed local government referendum a few years ago, which you may remember under the in the Gillard-Rudd era. And I regarded those changes as very dangerous to our federal system of government, which could have really tipped the balance between the states and the federal government even further than it already has since 1920 in the Engineers case. And I realised when making all those arguments against that change and the risks of those change that they equally applied to changing our constitution to become a republic. So logic dictated that I follow through on that, and I now describe myself as a constitutional conservative. Which brings me, of course, to this proposed change. I appreciate very much where Damien and Julian are coming from on this, and I've had many conversations with both of them about it. And I entirely share their concerns about the insertion of a symbolic preamble or other symbolic language in the Constitution. There is great constitutional risk in that, and what the High Court would in future do with a preamble like that, we can only speculate. I also share their concerns about the insertion of a racial discrimination clause. I think it is rightly being called a one-clause Bill of Rights, and it should be opposed and hopefully would be defeated were it to be proposed. I have to say, and I also am quite comfortable with this idea of a declaration of recognition outside the Constitution. My support for it would hinge very much on how it was worded, and it would be vitally important that it was worded in an inclusive way and in a way that unites Australians and doesn't divide them. And there is great risk in this area that it would not be uniting and that would be divisive, but I think it has potential. It's an opportunity to reaffirm, for example, our British institutions as much as anything else. So provided it was worded correctly, I'd be happy to support that. Where I part company with Damien and Julian is with this proposed alternative model of some body, some representative body of some kind to be inserted into the Constitution and a requirement put on the Parliament to consult this body. I don't share their confidence that a High Court that may do something dangerous with a preamble wouldn't also do something dangerous with this. I think if we don't trust the High Court with symbolic language in the Constitution, we should be very cautious in trusting a future High Court, perhaps not today, but in 25 or 50 or 100 years' time, and how they would interpret a requirement on the Parliament to consult an Indigenous advisory body, and what exactly and how exactly consultation would be defined. For example, if the Parliament proposed a law and this Indigenous advisory body said unanimously that it was a bad law and it should not proceed, and the Parliament nonetheless made no changes to that law and proceeded exactly as it is, are we confident that a future High Court would agree that that was sufficient consultation? How long a period should this consultation require? If the Parliament takes no heed at all of the advice provided, is that really consultation at all? And even if we were able to design it in such a sufficiently robust way that we could be absolutely sure that there would never ever be a legal veto proposed by this advisory body, I'm absolutely certain, as Keith mentioned, that it would at the very least, represent a political veto. No government would proceed with a proposed change of law, no matter how widely it was supported in the Parliament, if it was unanimously opposed by this new Indigenous advisory body. I think the fact that we don't have details about how this Indigenous advisory body would be formed and set up is a very big issue. And I think it is a very significant failing of the Referendum Council that its final report following the nationwide consultations and summits provided no further detail on this. And I think it's a particular failing given that more than $35 million of taxpayers' money has been given to the Referendum Council and its sister body, Recognise, which has been campaigning to generate political support for a change in the Constitution. That's $35 million of your money that's been provided to one side of the case of a constitutional argument, and no money has been provided to the alternative side of that case, and it may soon be put to the Australian people to make a decision. And yet with that extraordinary expense of taxpayers' money, they were able to provide no more detail than that there should be a voice of Indigenous people to the Parliament. I think that is a huge omission. The other omission coming out of the Uluru Summit and the subsequent Referendum Council report is, of course, the other ideas proposed to change the Constitution in some way to accommodate Indigenous Australians that I have some sympathy for. As you would all be familiar, there are two parts of the Constitution which refer to race. Keith Windschuttle referred to 5126 before, the so-called races power. It's important that when we think about this power and refer to this power, we remember that it's not only aimed and can not only be used against Indigenous Australians, but it can actually be used against Australians of all races, and it could theoretically enable the Parliament to make a law for Irish Australians or Italian Australians or Indian Australians. And of course the other section of the Constitution, section 25, which deals with what would happen in the event that a state government decided to exclude Australians of a race, including Indigenous Australians, from voting. Now, most people agree that Section 25 is a redundant part of the Constitution and there'll be no harm from removing it. Section 5126 obviously has a number of acts and programs of the federal government that rest upon it, and changing that in some way or removing it altogether does have flow-on implications that we do need to carefully think about. But as a matter of principle, I agree with some Indigenous advocates who say that it is not appropriate for in the 21st century in a liberal democracy to have a constitution which refers to race at all. And that's why I'm very sympathetic to the Institute of Public Affairs point of view, which is there is no place for race in the Constitution, and that if we are to make any changes to the Constitution at all, it should be to remove references to race. Race is an outdated and false concept, and we shouldn't be dividing Australians on racial lines in our law or in our Constitution. But the Referendum Council has put both of those ideas to one side when, in fact, the existence of these two provisions was one of the great impetuses for change and one of the reasons why many people supported change, and it appears that they've only done so out of political convenience. They've said that they're going for an all or nothing approach. We either adopt the approach of the advisory body or you have no constitutional change at all, even though they had previously been very critical of these provisions of the Constitution. So I think the Referendum Council has not done its own cause or the Australian taxpayers who funded it much good at all, and hasn't actually left us in a very good place to resolve this issue. And now we have an incredible weight of expectations on the government to address this issue. Damien's right that we are here because John Howard initially proposed this change. Julie Gillard, Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott were all at various times advocates of some form of change. I don't want to breach the confidences of any of those people. You can imagine which of those I'm likely to have spoken to on this topic and which of them I've not likely spoken to on this topic. But I would be very surprised if, with maybe two exceptions, any of the people who had previously advocated those ideas would advocate them again today in the same way they have, particularly given the path we had gone down. So just because as Prime Ministers they may have put it on the agenda, we should not rest our advocacy for that change now on their previous statements, because I suspect you'll find, and you may yet find in time, and maybe Tony will talk to you more about it tonight, that their past support is something that they're reflecting on very carefully now.
Thank you, just for the information of the audience, the preamble is on the screen. That is the preamble to the Constitution Act, not the preamble to the Constitution. The Constitution is Section 9 of that Act. Some of us would have difficulty in amending a preamble on the basis that a preamble speaks from the time that a document is entered into. Can you really amend a preamble? Some of us would say, some purists would say. What John Howard proposed was that there be a preamble to the Constitution. The Constitution is Section 9 of the Act of the Imperial Parliament, the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. And his proposal was to slip in there a preamble which would do many things, including honouring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the nation's first people, for their deep kinship with their lands and for their ancient and continuing cultures which enrich the life of the country. That was part of a large portrait that he presented to the people as a separate preamble at the time of the Republican referendum. That was rejected 60-39. There is also, as referred to, Section 25, which is a spent provision, meaning it's no longer relevant, which says that if by the law of any state all persons of any race are disqualified from voting at elections, then in reckoning the number of people of the state or of the Commonwealth, persons of that race resident in that state shall not be counted. Rather than being a regressive provision, Keith has argued, I think with some, I've been persuaded that that really was a progressive provision at the time. Anyway, it's spent. And then there's Section 51. Section 51 is the section which gives a large number of powers to the Commonwealth to be shared with the states. And in the 1967 referendum, that was changed because it gave a power to legislate with respect to the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state, for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. Now, in the 1967 referendum, that provision that the Commonwealth could not legislate with respect to Aboriginal people was removed. I remember at the Constitutional Convention, Reg Withers told me, he was a senator, those of you who are older might remember he was a Liberal senator. He said that Menzies was opposed to this. Menzies thought it was a mistake because he said you could do anything you wanted to help the Aboriginal people by making grants, conditional grants to the states. There's a section which allows this, Section 96. Conditional grants to the states. You have this money, provided you do this for the Aboriginal people. His argument, according to Senator Withers, was that if the Commonwealth got a power to do this, they would build up some bureaucratic monstrosity, that it would be a complete mess. That was what he said. And there was also a section which was repealed in 1967 in reckoning the number of people of the Commonwealth or of a state or other part of the Commonwealth. Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. That went out in 1967. It's often referred to as the census provision, but it's not really related to the census. It's more in relation to sizes of electorates and so on. So on that point, do any other members of the panel wish to comment? Jai or Nick?
I think one of the other tests to apply to these measures would be, and certainly what I'd like to see as an outcome, you see in the Aboriginal communities extremely high levels of violence, poor health and other concerns. So any such proposal should improve the life of the Aboriginal people in some meaningful and practical way, rather than just in a token, or perhaps not tokenistic, but symbolic, as the word has been used today, way. So I think that's a pretty good litmus test for a test as a first measure. And then, of course, the other things that have been described today are very sensible things to test it against as well. What will the unintended consequences be also?
Thank you. If any member of the audience would like to ask a question, would you raise your hand, please? And a microphone will be brought to you. Yes. Microphone, thank you.
A comment, first of all, David, that I find it positively Orwellian that we're talking about the need to remove any reference to race from the Constitution and then establishing a body that will represent a race. However, that aside, if we were clever enough to avoid any consequences that involved the High Court, and if the Senator is correct and it really came down to just a political question, has anyone given consideration to the fact that in a day of runaway internationalism, why wouldn't the United Nations get involved if there were claims of us being, what was it used in South Africa? What was the term? Apartheid. If we set up different states for particular races of people, I mean, the implications of this internationally are horrendous.
Yes, Keith Windschuttle.
Well, hello. Is that working? Yeah. Look, the United Nations is deeply. It's up to its knees in involvement in this issue because it's accepted a declaration of the rights of Indigenous people. And that's one of the big strengths which the Aboriginal political class in Australia is relying upon. And so they should, because the principal author of the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights happens to be an Australian Aboriginal, Mick Dodson, and we, the Commonwealth, funded an office in Geneva for ATSIC, which allowed Mick to sit there and dictate to the rest of the world what the Indigenous rights were. And so we're likely to end up with the High Court saying, as it did in Mabo, oh, we have to take account of international opinion and international law, even though in the Mabo case we're dealing with common law, breaking making a big inconsistency. But what they're really doing is just simply enshrining the view of Mick Dodson's of the world as into a judgment. Instead of having Mick Dodson in front of them to give evidence, they're doing it in a backdoor sort of way. But the effect, in fact, is far more powerful. The backdoor way is far more powerful because very few people realise what's going on.
Thank you. Yes, Senator?
Just one additional comment, responding to your first point about the Orwellian nature of removing race and adding race at the same time. I agree with you, obviously. And that's where I guess perhaps my most fundamental objection to this comes from. Obviously, I have conservative objections about the risks of this to our constitution, but I have a liberal objection too, which is that fundamentally I don't believe we should divide Australians according to their race in our laws or in our constitution. And if we were to say that Indigenous Australians needed to have a separate voice to the Parliament to every other Australian, then effectively what we're saying is the Australian Parliament represents some Australians, and there would be another representative body, whether we call it a Parliament or an advisory group or a representative body or whatever else, that represents Indigenous Australians because they're so different to the rest of us racially that they need a different representative group. I've got a very fundamental problem with that, aside from kind of practical things like should some Australians have 2 votes at a federal election and other people only have 1? I don't think so.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes. Father.
To any member of the panel, can anything be drawn from the experience in, say, Canada on some of these issues which are being discussed today?
Canada is the most powerful precedent in this whole discussion. And if you look at my book, there's a guy, Tom Flanagan, who's contributed to the debate in Australia through Gary Johns' book, and he's also got a book out of his own. If you want to look up Tom Flanagan, he shows that the problem. Well, in fact, one of the logical consequences of the idea that the Indigenous people of Canada are the First Nations has been the establishment of the state of Nunavut, which used to be the Northwest Territories, used to be a province of Canada. Now it's a quasi-independent body run by the 28,000 people who still live in the Northwest Territories, but which give them a veto or a lot of political clout in terms of preventing things like gas pipelines crossing the Caribou Trail and all those. The environmentalists swarm to this like a decaying corpse because it's the Indigenous people have a means of preventing things that the environmentalists, despite all their clout, can't do themselves.
Well, thank you. Damien,
could I just say, David, also, look, the concept of First Nations is a Canadian concept, and if you look at the literature of Aboriginal people in Australia today, that's the description they give themselves. They say, we are First Nations. And as I said before, when John Howard said, well, you can't have treaties are between sovereign nations. Well, the Aborigines are saying, but we are a nation. We were a nation before you white people came here. Well, they were not, and in fact, it's been established in law by William Burton, one of the great judges, in my view, in Australia's 19th century, who gave the definitive decision on this in the New South Wales Supreme Court, saying that the Aborigines have not reached the state of nationhood. And if you look at it in international law, only nations can be sovereigns, and the political class in Australia have taken this on board, and the title First Nations, which originated in Canada, has picked up in North America, and now I think the Aborigines in Brazil have decided to use it as well. It's sort of floating around the globe like these ideas do these days. They want the sovereignty goes to nations, so they say we are the First Nations, and even someone who I know slightly but admire greatly is Warren Mundine. Warren Mundine's picked up on the First Nations. I haven't read his book. He's got a new book out, which I haven't read, but in some things in the press, which I quote in my own book, He was using First Nation some time ago, and he's part of the Wiradjuri group. There's a native title claim in for about half of central western New South Wales, and he's one of the claimants for that. And they want the native title from Moree down to Broken Hill virtually, and they'll get it. And it's rich with, everything we know under the ground.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, how much...
The microphone's coming.
Like the Andrew Bolt case makes you actually an Aborigine. If you're 94% European and 5% Aborigine, just because you want to side with the Aborigine part of you, how does that...
Well, that's a very good question, and there used to be a Commonwealth definition, so it had three parts. You had to be, you had to regard yourself as an Aborigine. Other people of your kinship group or tribe had to recognise you as an Aborigine, and there was a third one. You had to actually be able to show some descent. Now there's been several court cases on this, and one of which. I won't go into Robert French, who I have very low opinion of in this field. But the whole thing is that whole three-part definition is now gone by the board, and anyone who claims to be an Aborigine cannot really be challenged. And well, it's true. In money, handouts of money, in gaining benefits to go to university tuition, all that sort of stuff. Even your status before a Royal Commission. If you claim it, then, or even if someone claims it on your behalf, in the case that French decided, and even if you don't want to be called an Aborigine, if someone else really decides you are an Aborigine, then you are.
Peter Manuel.
Yeah, Damien, with this change, is this going to stop the abuse that a lot of what's happening in remote areas? Is it going to give Aboriginals more jobs? Is it going to build more self-esteem? Or is it going to be open a Pandora box for lawyers to make a lot of money?
Yeah, I think, well, let me speak to the range of concerns you put there. I think the first thing I'd say is I admit making a change to the Constitution isn't going to, in and of itself, change the lived experience of any Aborigines. We all know that, right? I mean, that would be silly to pretend that we amend the Constitution and the next day they wake up and everything's changed. I mean, we all know that's not the case. They certainly believe that this would help improve the situation. It would enable better policy making. To give one example of that, a big part of these people, and I must say, look, I don't come to this as someone who had a lot of experience of Indigenous people. I hadn't had any experience. I came to this as someone who was concerned about the Constitution, so I didn't have a lot of background. But something that I hear from these people is a long history of feeling that decisions have been made for them or imposed on them. A lot of their sense is that better policy outcomes would be achieved if they were appropriately part of the procedure for making it. So the example there is, if you look at the intervention in the Northern Territory, which a lot of them were opposed to, right? Now, Noel Pearson had brought in some similar measures in Cape York. The difference, at least one relevant difference, was the people in Cape York had been part of the process that brought in these reforms, so they felt these had been brought in a way that they could accept and they could work with. So certainly they genuinely believe that if they're part of the process, you will get better policy outcomes. That's one thing I'd say. As I've got the microphone, let me just respond to 2 points. One is to say, just Senator Patterson's comment about consultation. It may well be correct to say this query about consultation. But one thing I would point out is at least some of the formulation that is now being looked at would be to reduce this so that there wasn't a constitutional obligation to consult. You know, that's one possibility that the Indigenous people themselves are looking at. So I don't, you know, it's not yet at a point where we're locked into an option that might be unpalatable. It may, certainly they're talking about one possibility would be to take out the constitutional obligation for consultation. Senator Patterson's referring to the version that's drafted by Professor Anne Toomey, but I've heard conversations since then that a weaker version would be possible. The other point was that Warren Mundine's proposal's been mentioned. Warren Mundine creates quite a different approach to this, right? He doesn't have this idea that there should be an advisory body that tells Parliament what to do. His sense of what it would mean to give voice to these people is quite different. And that is an option that's out there, and one that, to be honest, is not particularly threatening to anyone, I think, his version. And it is a version that the Indigenous people around the country seem to be taking to, and it is an option that seems to be guided towards the idea that we could achieve better policy for these people by empowering them to be more involved in the policy making. And certainly, if you care to read his version, you'll see it's not at all saying that there should be a national advisory body that imposes its will on the Parliament. His idea is quite differently structured.
Well, and just to add to that, in fact, Warren Mundine is opposed to a national consultative body requirement in the Constitution. He wrote a very powerful article in the Financial Review saying why he thought it was a really bad idea. But his model, and I agree with him on that, but his model is more radical in some other ways because the end product which he envisages is treaties. And his point of view on treaties is not that. I think an important point that there couldn't be one national treaty because there was no nation, certainly on a national scale, for Indigenous communities before European settlement. There were many tribes and many different nations, if we want to call it that, although I hasten to take on Keith's admonition about that. And so he envisages multiple treaties between multiple groups and the Australian government as the end product of his model. So while I agree with his reservations about the national consultative constitutional model, what he proposes is quite a different and radical idea in a different way.
Thank you, Senator. On that point, we must move on, but let me stress that ACM does not take a position on this. Did you wish to? One word.
It seems to be the next branch of this great philosophy of going for
Well, thank you for that comment. Yes, ACM takes no position on these matters. It's to inform about the Constitution and stress how important the Constitution is to us and fundamentally what a very good Constitution it is.